It began with the smell. A smell so faint at first you could mistake it for the dampness of old wood or the stale breath of a house that hadn't been aired out in decades. But it lingered, clinging to your clothes, settling in your hair, seeping into your skin. Hi everyone. Welcome to Buried Truths. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep, because once you hear it, you won't be able to unknow it. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of rural America, though the locals will never tell you where, there was a man who lived alone. He didn't draw much attention, didn't speak much, and when he did, his voice was so soft that people leaned in to hear him, and often wished they hadn't. He was polite, yes, but there was something off. His eyes seemed to focus just past you, as if staring at something behind your shoulder. When he walked into town, he bought groceries that didn't make sense for a single man. Fresh flowers every week, expensive perfume, fabric softener. But no meat, no bread, nothing to actually live on. People assumed he was eccentric, maybe a widower still clinging to the ghost of his wife. They weren't wrong. In the attic of his collapsing farmhouse, behind a door that never should have been opened, was a bedroom frozen in time. White lace curtains yellowed with dust, a vanity covered in glass perfume bottles, and on the bed, she lay there, skin stretched tight over her bones, hair brittle but still combed, her hands folded neatly over her stomach, the scent of flowers and rot tangled together in the air, a sick perfume that only he could stand to breathe for years. You see, she had died a decade earlier, but in his mind, his fractured, rotting mind, she was still his companion. He spoke to her every night, told her about his day, sat beside her, stroking her hand until the skin began to tear. He kept her dressed in fresh cloths. He dabbed perfume at her neck, even whispered apologies when the sunlight through the attic window made her face crumble just a little more. And the truth of why he did it was something the whole town had buried long before her body. They say grief makes people do strange things. But this wasn't grief. This was possession, though not in the way of ghosts or demons. No, this was a man possessed by a moment in time, a single twisted love story that refused to rot along with the flesh. The woman in the attic had once been the most beautiful girl in town, or so the old men at the bar still whispered after too many drinks. She had soft eyes, the kind that could make you forget your own name, and a way of speaking that made even the simplest words sound like secrets. But beauty has a cruel currency in small, isolated towns, especially one with more secrets than streetlights. She had married young, too young, and not to the man in the farmhouse, but to someone far closer in blood. The locals never spoke of it directly, just said things like, "Well, you know how some families are." But in truth, she was the child of generations of the same family tree folding back on itself. Her face was familiar to everyone, because they all carried a trace of it. The man in the farmhouse had been her neighbor, her shadow, not her lover, at least not then. He was the one who drove her to the hospital when she fell sick, the one who brought groceries when her husband disappeared. People thought he was just helping. But there's a difference between kindness and obsession. When she died, quietly, in her own bed, something inside him cracked. He didn't call a doctor. He didn't call her family. He simply locked the front door, drew the curtains, and began his vigil. Days passed, then weeks. The flowers rotted in their vases. The air turned heavy, sweet, and wrong. But in his mind, she wasn't gone. He told himself she was only sleeping. He dressed her in her finest gown, sat her upright in that attic bed, and spoke to her as if each word could coax her back. When the skin began to change, when her lips lost their color, he food and makeup at the general store, rouge to paint her cheeks, powder to hide the spots where the bone began to peek through. He became both caretaker and undertaker, and for 10 years, He never let her go. By the time the smell reached the neighbors, they had already grown used to strange things drifting from that house. Burnt meat, chemical fumes, the sour tang of old wood left wet too long. But this scent was different. It clung to the back of the throat, sweet and rancid, like fruit left to liquefy in a summer cellar. They said the first to notice was a boy who had chased his dog too far up the hill. The animal stopped dead at the fence, hackles raised, whining. When the boy leaned over the rotted boards to call him back, he caught sight of the attic window. The curtain fluttered just enough to reveal a face, pale, rigid, unmoving. Word spread quickly, as it always does in places where gossip is a form of currency. But no one dared knock on his door. They remembered his temper from years past, the way he could change from quiet to violent without warning. Besides, people here had learned that if you left something alone long enough, it might simply fade away. It didn't. The smell grew worse. Visitors to the town began to ask about it, wrinkling their noses as they passed the farmhouse. Locals just muttered, "Don't go near there." Some even crossed the street rather than walk past the gate. One autumn night, a particularly bad storm rolled in, tearing shingles from rooftops and snapping branches from the bare trees. Lightning lit up the sky, and in that brief flash, one neighbor swore she saw him in the attic window, holding the woman's skeletal hand, his lips moving as if reciting a prayer. The next morning, water from the broken roof had leaked into the attic. Neighbors could hear him dragging heavy furniture, shoving it against the walls to block the rain. It was the first sound from the house in weeks. And then, something else. A laugh. Soft, almost like a lover's chuckle. But there was no one to laugh with him. Years passed like this, his hair whitening, his back bending. The woman upstairs, frozen in the moment of her death, stayed exactly as she was. Or at least, that's how he wanted to believe. What no one knew was that he had begun talking to her in the voice she once had. At night, he spoke to himself in two tones, his own and hers, answering questions, making plans, whispering love. In his mind, she never left, and neither did he. It is difficult to understand how someone can live with death so long that it becomes ordinary. But for him, the corpse was not a corpse. It was a wife, a partner, a piece of his soul preserved in fragile flesh. He did not see the sagging skin, the hollow sockets, the brittle hair that fell like cobwebs onto the pillow. He saw her as she had been the day she died, and that illusion was enough to keep him breathing. He maintained her with the care of a man tending to something sacred. When the smell worsened, he soaked rags in perfume and draped them near her body. When the skin began to slip, he carefully pinned it in place with fine sewing needles. And when her mouth sagged open in that eternal, voiceless scream, he stuffed it with soft cotton, shaping her lips back into the faint smile he remembered. But there were nights when the illusion cracked. When the house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock downstairs, and he would wake in the dark to the sound of shifting. Not the creak of old wood, not the drip of rain, but the sound of movement inside the bed. The first time it happened, he convinced himself it was a dream. The second time, he sat up and stared, heart pounding. The shadows seemed to shift around her, the blanket rising just slightly as if with a breath. He leaned closer, so close he could see the empty sockets beneath her eyelids. And then he felt it, the faintest touch of fingers brushing his hand. He told himself it was muscle memory, nerves twitching long after death. But deep down, in the place where rational thought dissolves into fear, he knew that wasn't possible after 10 years. Still, he stayed. He told her stories about the world beyond the walls, even though he hadn't left the property in years. He read her the local newspaper. He celebrated anniversaries, placing withered flowers in a vase beside her bed. He even cooked dinner for two, setting a plate in front of her skeletal frame as though she might take a bite at any moment. And each time the night came, he found himself listening, waiting for the soft, impossible sound of her moving in the dark. They say time rots everything, wood, stone, even memory, but in the house on the edge of that forgotten street, time seemed to have stopped. 10 years. That's how long he claimed she'd been there. Not buried, not cremated, not even acknowledged as gone. Just there. Sitting in her favorite chair, head tilted slightly to the side, a faded silk shawl draped across her shoulders. Neighbors spoke in whispers, saying they could see her silhouette in the window long after her funeral. Others swore they smelled something when the wind blew east, something sweet and rancid, like flowers wilting in a closed room. He told anyone who asked that she was simply unwell, that she couldn't come to the door. And people, they stopped asking. That's how silence works in small towns. It becomes the safest answer. In his mind, she wasn't dead. Or maybe she was, just not gone. He brushed her hair every morning, untangling the brittle strands that broke away like cobweb threads. He read to her in the evenings, his voice steady, sometimes laughing softly as though she'd whispered back. At night, he tucked a blanket over her knees. Even when the skin beneath her gown turned paper thin and the hollows of her eyes deepened into shadows, he acted as though the change was nothing more than age. It's easy to call it madness. Harder to admit what else it could have been. Devotion. Or guilt. Some who knew the couple before whispered of debts, of an argument that ended with a silence too heavy to lift. Others hinted at secrets that went deeper. Bloodlines, family ties that blurred in ways no one dared to document. One winter, a letter arrived. No one knows who sent it. It was small, the paper yellowed, the writing thin and spidery. Just one sentence. Bury her, before she buries you. No one saw him for days after that. But when he returned to the grocer, he carried on as if nothing had happened. Except the curtains in that upstairs room were drawn forever after. The smell was the first thing the police noticed. Not the house's peeling paint or the piles of unopened letters spilling from the slot, but the thick, suffocating scent that hit them as soon as the door creaked open. It wasn't decay, not exactly. It was layered, like a history of rot and preservation battling for dominance. Inside, the air was still, heavy enough to taste. Every surface was coated in a fine film of dust, except for one spot. Her chair. The fabric beneath her, though faded, was smooth from years of being sat in, by her, and, after her, by the version of her he refused to let go of. She was dressed in white, though not the white of purity, but the yellowed white of age and neglect. Her hands, thin as twigs, rested neatly on her lap, the nails filed with careful precision. They found him in the kitchen, making tea. He greeted them with a nod, speaking in a voice so ordinary it was almost chilling. He poured 3 cups, one for each of them, and one for her. He insisted they sit. He insisted she was listening. The officers exchanged looks, each silently urging the other to be the one to say it. But no one did. In their hesitation, the house seemed to take on a pulse of its own, the tick of the old grandfather clock syncing with something unseen. One officer noticed the photographs on the wall, dozens of them, all black and white, all of the same woman at different ages. Only in the later photos, her smile was absent. Her eyes seemed duller, and in the last few, her skin looked tight and wrong, like paper stretched over clay. In a back drawer, beneath stacks of unpaid bills, they found an old marriage certificate. The date was wrong, the names familiar. But the birth records? They told a different story. She wasn't just his wife. She had been his cousin. First cousin. And there were whispers from the town archives of something even closer than that, though. No official record dared to confirm it. Still, he swore he hadn't kept her out of malice or madness. He said he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone in the dark. But in the end, the question wasn't why he kept her. It was what he thought she would eventually do, if he didn't. The authorities removed her slowly, carefully, though he begged them not to. His voice broke, not in the wailing way of grief, but in the quiet cracking of something ancient and fragile. He followed them to the hearse, his eyes never leaving the thin outline of her body beneath the shroud. When she was gone, the house became something else entirely. Without her presence, or the illusion of it, it was just wood and dust and echoes. The chairs sagged deeper, the walls leaned more, and the air felt colder. Neighbors swore that in the nights after she was taken, they saw him sitting alone in the window, staring into the dark as though waiting for her to return. A week later, the man was gone. No note, no sign of struggle. Only the empty teacups remained on the table, one still filled for her, untouched. The police combed the surrounding woods and riverbanks, but he was never found. Some said he left to follow her. Others whispered that the house didn't let him leave, that it had claimed both of them, binding them together in whatever quiet, unnatural way he had always imagined. Years passed. The house fell into ruin, the roof collapsing, the porch sinking into the earth. But on certain nights, when the fog rolls thick through the valley, the locals claim they can see a light burning in the upstairs window. And if you stand close enough, you might hear the faint clink of porcelain, the slow creak of a chair, and two voices murmuring softly, one living, one not. The story faded from headlines, but in small corners of the town's history archives, the file still exists. Yellowed pages, a marriage certificate, and a grainy photograph of a man and woman seated side by side in that same parlor. The man is smiling faintly. The woman's eyes are empty, and if you stare long enough, you might notice the edges of her smile aren't flesh at all, but wax. Every story leaves a scar. Drop yours in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Something is always listening.